Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple systems here in front of me that need feeding. These are my European nightcrawlers, and some of my European nightcrawlers reside inside of this VERMIBAG mini, and the rest of them are in this little plastic tote or bus box or bus bin, whatever you want to call it. It's not really a tote container. And I've got some food here. It's just a bunch of stuff that I had in my freezer. There's a couple pieces of cucumber here. I split this cucumber in half. There's a whole bunch of other things in here, such as soup greens, peelings from carrots, and things like that. It's actually kind of a big chunk, so hopefully I'll be able to break it up into smaller pieces before we place it into the bins. And I've also got a big bag over here, and it's really nothing more than a whole bunch of shredded brown paper bag material. It's a whole bag of it, quite a bit. Kind of dry, so I was thinking I might actually spray that down with a little bit of water as it gets placed into the bins. But since these are European nightcrawlers, I'm pretty sure they really like the bedding. And up until now, there's been a lot of leaves used as bedding in these, but I had all this paper. I decided I would shred it all up, and we're going to use that today as our bedding. I've also got one of my staple feeding items down here, which is the used coffee. Something I always somehow forget to add. I kind of push it off to the side, and then when I'm done feeding, I realize I've not used any of it. So hopefully we'll not forget to add this today. So I think we'll start in the VERMIBAG Mini, as we usually do. So why don't we move the camera in a little bit closer, and we'll get started. Down here in the VERMIBAG Mini, in the past I had just used a single plastic bag, but I figured I would use this other one. Only because this one that we've been using for a while seemed like it was a little bit small. Didn't seem like it went all the way out to the edges. So I figured I might try to increase my ability to keep the moisture within the bin from evaporating by trying to get a plastic that actually reaches all the way around from edge to edge. And we can see quite a bit of moisture, evidence of the moisture down in here. It's kind of dark down the middle. These leaves have been here for a few weeks now. I bought these in mainly to kind of use them as decoration almost. They looked really neat in the beginning. They all had these crazy vivid orange and red colors, but they're really starting to lose their color. So I think what we're going to do today is something we hinted at last week already, which is to simply use this material as bedding at this point. Because it looks good and everything in the beginning, but at this point it's just brown junk. And besides that, we've got some fresh bedding we can use on the top. So we'll sink this down to go down into the feeding zone with the food. And then I think we'll just sprinkle the top with a little bit of some of that fresh paper that I bought in here. The feeding that we put in here 8 days ago consisted of something that a number of people questioned, which is the skins of some potatoes. I used some potato skins, and people questioned whether that was something that, you know, should or shouldn't be used in a worm bin. I've used it in the past, and I've not had problems. I've used it quite often, as a matter of fact. So I didn't worry too much about it. I didn't even look too much into the topic in terms of why it was even questioned. So I couldn't even tell you offhand why it's considered to be maybe a no-no in the worm bins, but I don't know. I hear so many things that are supposedly no-nos in a worm bin that I know work just fine, and I'm, you know, kind of a skeptic when I hear things that I should or shouldn't be doing. I'm the type that typically wants to kind of experiment on my own and, you know, come to the determination of what's doable and what's not doable on my own if possible. Not with everything. Obviously, some things are clearly, you know, things that you would not want to do or things you would not want to use in your worm bins, but to me it just seemed like, you know, what could be wrong with giving them some potato peels. And I mean, I think that was what I saw a few traces of in the beginning. I thought that was a piece of potato peel that I was fiddling around with earlier. Maybe I've just not dug down deep enough, but as far as I could tell, looks like it's mostly gone, if not all gone at this point. I mean, I'm encountering pieces of paper. These are scraps of paper that were actually food bundles. And I know that because the food was delivered into here maybe, I don't even know, maybe a month ago at this point, in paper, newspaper bundles. And the food has since been eaten, as far as I can tell, but the paper still remains to serve as sort of a carbon food source and as bedding. There's other things in here, kind of slow composting items. I think this is the shell of a mango seed, one that I had actually sliced into multiple pieces. That's why it's got these straight edges and stuff. And maybe I'm just not digging down deep enough, or maybe the worms have actually depleted the majority, if not all, of the food that they received last time. That's pretty good. And that also includes a lot of the paper that was in here. It did seem to me like a week ago there was just a huge amount of paper in here still. But I'm glad that the worms are making good use of it and consuming it. And I'm sure here and there I'll find a few more pieces. Here's another piece that looks like I didn't locate earlier. Here's the stem of a banana. It's the sort of thing that might take a couple weeks to break down, but they'll definitely eat it. It'll just take a little bit longer than the rest of the banana peel. So I think we've excavated a large enough hole that we can place today's feeding into. I'm going to just go ahead and use these leaves at this point as the bedding for today's feeding, sort of underneath the food. And then the paper that we use at the end is, also technically going to count as bedding too. Although in my mind, somehow bedding seems like something that should be under something, because I sleep on a bed. So the bed for me is under me when I'm sleeping on it or lying on it. So for me to think of bedding as being above something seems counterintuitive. But I would think that if you're placing paper on top of the material in your bin, that also counts as bedding. So let's grab the food that I bought down here today. It's a pretty good amount. I guess we'll begin with this cucumber. It's starting to look pretty nasty with all these black spots on it and stuff. I've got some daylight streaming in here too from the window. Hopefully it doesn't throw the exposure off too much. And like I said before, the food is kind of in a big chunk. Let's see if I can break off a couple pieces of it. Okay, this is a pretty good sized piece. Alright, well that's another big piece. And I think I've definitely left enough for the other system we're going to be feeding, which is probably not as heavily as populated as this one. So for this one to get a little bit more is probably fine. This does actually seem like maybe a bit more food than I would normally feed. Although maybe not so much. As I'm breaking it up, it seems like it's not so huge of an amount. It's a lot of really fine parsley leaves, carrot shavings, parsnip shavings, and maybe some other stuff I'm not identifying. I think it's a call rob or whatever it's called. These things are kind of cool. As they start to break down, they eat up all the soft, fleshy vegetable, and then the more tough parts of the stem seem to remain usually, I think. So we've got ourselves a nice portion of food in here. As this stuff starts to thaw and starts to get eaten, it'll shed moisture. So it'll add to the moisture level in this bin. I don't think the moisture level in the bin is a problem. I think the moisture level in here is actually pretty good. Nevertheless, I do like the idea of keeping that plastic covering on to help retain the moisture and not allow it to all ventilate out and evaporate and dry out. In the past, I always felt like I had, excessive dryness in my bins, but not since I started covering up with those plastic sheets. All right, so before we drop in the paper bedding that we're going to put on top, I've got the coffee. Not going to forget today. Oh, look at that. It's getting moldy. This stuff's been sitting around for a while. It's really beginning to add up. I don't know why. It seems like the stuff in the freezer has been adding up a lot too lately. Maybe I need more worms to help me do away with my compostable trash more quickly. So here it's pretty much food at this point. You can see food sticking out here. The coffee itself will serve as food. So in the past I've always really made an attempt to try to bury the food down deep and keep it out of reach of any sort of passerby insects that might decide to pop in here for a free meal. But I'm thinking if we scatter a whole bunch of that shredded paper on top, it might serve the same purpose. I'm not going to go too crazy worrying about covering all this food up with compost. Today I'm just going to scatter in a bunch of paper. Throwing it all over the place here. Once I cover this all up with the plastic again, it's going to capture a lot of the moisture coming out of the bedding, out of the freshly added food. But I don't want it to throw off the nice moisture level in the bin here. So I think I'm going to I've got my little water bottle here, my little squirt bottle. So I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce a little bit of water to go along with the dry paper, just so it doesn't end up sucking up all the moisture that's already in the bin and making things dry. The temperature has been dropping down more and more lately, so the heat's been kicking on regularly. And it's usually in the winter time that I start to experience dryness in my bins, and I don't know if it's got something to do with the forced hot air in my house. So I don't want it to just sort of creep up on me and suddenly I realize that I've got exceedingly dry material in my bins. I'm going to kind of anticipate that that's just something that happens in the winter, and it might have something to do with the heat now that it started kicking on. So I'm going to try to counteract that a little bit in advance, proactively, by making sure that I don't put anything in here that's going to throw off the moisture level one way or the other. Naturally, if I start seeing things start getting a bit too damp, I can always go the other way and, you know, maybe just leave off the plastic coverings or something. But I think this way we're going to end up with material that the worms are going to be able to come right up onto and enjoy if they want to do so, without it being exceedingly dry or such that it would make the worms not want to go there. I like this slightly larger piece of plastic too, the way it goes right out edge to edge. Help keep more of the moisture down within the bin rather than letting it vaporize and evaporate. Okay, things look pretty good in here. Let's head on over to the other tub and get that one fed too. Over here in this tub, we've got the same type of worm, European nightcrawlers. I'm using the same type of plastic covering here too. Nice how it goes edge to edge. Gives me full coverage of the entire bin. A lot of people question, how is it that the worms can breathe if you're covering things up so tight, hardly even allowing for any airflow around the edges of the container? And I think that it's not so much air that they need. Yes, they need oxygen, but I believe they extract the oxygen from the liquid, the fluid, the moisture around them, because they breathe through their skin, and obviously it's not, I don't think it's air that's actually flowing in and out of their bodies. I believe that it's the moisture that they're extracting the oxygen from. Because, you know, water is actually partly oxygen, H2O. And, you know, I'm no biologist, so I couldn't say for sure, but I do believe that since they breathe through their skin, as long as there's moisture, they'll be fine and they'll be able to breathe through their skin. Although that doesn't change the fact that you can still create an anaerobic environment in your bin. So the airflow is still important, but I think the anaerobic conditions apply more to the fact that maybe the microscopic life forms in the bin are not getting the oxygen they need. And that's when a different type of life form that might not need the oxygen starts to dominate, and that's when you start getting really funky odors. So cool how they'll take a piece of cantaloupe rind and they'll pick out all the softer material in between the tougher parts of the husk, or the parts of the rind, and they'll leave the rest of it for later until that breaks down a little bit better. You can see it's pretty dark in color. It's a worm cocoon right there on top of this piece of cardboard. I usually don't go out of my way looking for cocoons, but once in a while you just spot one right there on the surface. The material in this bin is really not very deep at all. I mean, it only goes up to my halfway up my fingertips, so that's probably 1.5 inches deep. So this bin is still fairly young. I believe it's only maybe 3.5 weeks old at this point, and it's only gotten a few feedings. I'll be curious to see if there's any potato skins left in here too, because it did seem like we found virtually none in the other container. Can't imagine that we would have just missed them all. But right here I'm seeing one, so that probably means we're going to see more. I got this feeling that this bin just doesn't have quite as many European nightcrawlers in it as the other, as the Vermibag Mini that we just fed. This is a half of the shell of a mango seed, and you can see where I had actually punched a hole through the side, because to me it seems like one of the most important things for the worms to be able to get inside of the mango seed. If you throw a mango seed in there without giving the worms some way to get into it, somehow into the middle of the into the middle of the seed, it'll just take them forever to, you know, eventually infiltrate the seed to get at the inside of it. Because it is the inside of it, I think, that they like the most. The seed that's in here is usually the really popular item. And they'll break this shell down too in time, but not as quickly as they'll break down the seed that's within there. I don't know. We definitely saw 1 or 2 pieces of potato skin when we first started looking around. I believe this is one too, but not much. And if you were to watch last week's video, or the video from 8 days ago, you would see that there was quite a decent amount placed in here for them to eat. So it's kind of interesting when once in a while you find a piece that's still quite intact, almost as if they hadn't touched it, but then you don't find any other traces of it anywhere, and you know there was a good amount of it placed in there. Kind of makes you wonder why they would have eaten all the rest of it, and certain bits of it they just never even touched. Kind of strange. So these are mango seeds. These were not part of the last feeding. These go way back. So it does take time for stuff like this to break down. They're pretty tough. But just like virtually anything you give them, they'll break it down. Some things just require a little bit more time than others. So like I said, I don't have a great deal of room in here. But like I usually prefer to do, I do prefer to use some form of bedding, put something beneath the food that I'm adding so that it sort of sucks up the juices that eventually spill out of the stuff as it thaws out and as it gets consumed. So the same as we did before, we're going to use some of the shredded paper. But I think we'll just scatter that on the bottom underneath the food that we're adding. Because I think out here on the surface I've got a good amount of cardboard and leafy materials. There's all kinds of bedding materials scattered across the bin that'll still serve as good sort of top cover bedding. But down here in the feeding area, we'll go ahead and we'll just we'll include some cardboard, because all the stuff that you're giving them, all the veggies and fruits and kitchen scraps and everything that they get, the coffee, all this stuff has got, you know, high nitrogen content. So you want to sort of balance that out a little bit by giving them a carbon food source as well. So while it's referred to usually as a bedding type of a material, making you think that it's there for them to kind of hang out in and reside in, it's equally useful as a food source too. So it's not just bedding, it's bedding and food. Let's see if we can get the last of this coffee out of here. Now in this case, I did not dampen the paper that I just added. It did seem to me like all this stuff that we're adding, fairly damp coffee grinds, a fair bit of material as well as this. Yeah, I mean, it's no different from the other one we just fed, it's true. But it did seem like we had a good amount of moisture in here, perhaps even a little more than I would typically want. So, another cocoon, I believe, right there. So I think we'll be okay with, you know, just scattering the food right on top of that paper. And I don't think it's going to cause things to dry out in this bin too much. It was just somehow, I don't know, in the VermiBag Mini, I was just getting this sort of weird feeling like things might be a little more dry in there than they need to be. So it seemed to me like adding a large amount of dry paper would potentially put things off balance a little bit, which I didn't want to have happen. It's just another shell of a mango seed. Some of the feedings that, you know, get added regularly, you saw me push things off to the side, so it always seems like the older feedings are kind of out here flanking the center. And it might actually be where you're going to find the greater number of worms, because that's a food that's already had a chance to break down considerably. Here's another piece of potato skin. So maybe we're finally starting to run into it out here on the outskirts. And then, you know, maybe the more recently added foods just need a little bit of time for the microorganisms to start breaking them down so that the worms can also take advantage of them. I do seem to see that pretty often. So I go right down into the middle where I had most recently fed, and I'll find worms, but not quite as many as I find elsewhere where some of the older foods from feedings gone by are located. And that might be what we're seeing here too, is like far greater number of worms, it seems, out here on the edge than we saw down the middle. And it could be that they're just drawn to some of the older food items that were added weeks and weeks ago that are finally breaking down to the point where they can eat them. There's a lot of foods, certain foods that does seem like the worms can eat right away. Soft things like, you know, very moist, damp things like watermelon, pumpkin, things like that. But other things, I think, require a fair bit of time before the worms can actually eat them. They need the microbes and the bacteria and everything, fungus and stuff in the bin to take a foothold and start breaking it down for them before they can start to take advantage of it. All right, lots of leaves, lots of bedding in here still, and this is kind of what my newer bins usually look like. Clear evidence of the materials that the bin was built with. In my case, a lot of cardboard bits, a lot of leafy bits. But then at some point, things start to change, you know, and then it starts to appear as if the predominant material in the bin is mainly castings at some point. So we'll get there soon, but like I said, I think that this bin is still somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 weeks old still, which is relatively young. I'm going to bring this piece of paper over with the plastic because they're kind of stuck to each other at this point. Let's see if I can get it in position here a little bit more easily just by dumping it off. I like using this piece of paper right under the plastic because it just becomes a place where the moisture that would otherwise evaporate gets captured, lands right on that piece of paper, and it makes it a place where the worms really enjoy coming up and hanging out and taking advantage of the moisture. I didn't have that in the other bin, although I do have it in a lot of my bins. We didn't do it in the VermiBag Mini. Maybe at some point in the future, if I don't forget, I'll do the same thing. Try to lay down a piece of paper right beneath the plastic to make it into a little bit of a moisture haven for the worms to hang out in and enjoy. All right, so my European nightcrawlers are now fed, and it did seem like after 8 days it was due. I wasn't sure. It did seem like the last feeding was pretty plentiful, so I was a little bit unsure of whether they would need food today, but it certainly did seem like they did. So I'm sure they'll appreciate it. And it did seem like a pretty plentiful feeding, but I say that very often. I bet we come back in here in another week and stuff will be gone again. So that's the beauty of composting with worms. You've always got someplace to put your compostable kitchen scraps. So I got a little bit of cleaning up to do around here, and I'll put everything away, but I'm not going to bore you with that because that's not too exciting. I'll just leave it at that. But before I sign off, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.